Okay. One of the things that you have to understand about studying U.S. history is that everything that happens here starts somewhere else. Everything that happens in American history is because of something that's happening somewhere else in the world. So we always approach it from what we call a transnational history approach. In order to figure out why something happens in the U.S., we have to look at where that movement or that trend or that situation originates. And today is going to be the day that we cover the most ground on this topic, because we're going to cover like arguably 2,500 years of history in 1 month. In order so that you can understand why the people that arrived on the American continent at the time that they did, what it was that they were coming from, and where it was that they were going, and why. So, if you have a question about what I'm covering, or you're confused, just let me know. I'll slow down and back up as much as you need me to. Tell me your name. Doug. I'm sorry? Doug? Yes. DR. Okay, Kiana, we have a seating chart, unfortunately. And so I hate to do this to you, but I'm going to move you into one of the empty seats. Okay, there's this empty seat next to Agnes over there. And then there's this two front. I wouldn't do it if I didn't have to. Everyone can do it. No, you're fine. Huh? Okay, I'll do it. Okay, so let's get moving on our transnational history. The way that we picture the world, because we are in America, is with Asia and Europe on one half of the globe and America on the other half, right? Mostly world maps that you've seen, that's what you see. I mean, some of them, Europe is a little, Asia is a little bit smaller, and America is a little bit bigger. That's because we are American exceptionalists, and we think of America as pretty much, you know, the center of the universe. That's not actually the way that the world felt to the people of this time that we're talking about. To them, this was the center of the universe. And I'm going to share this. I got to share this on the screen. Maybe. Okay. Okay. All right. So the center of the world, as far as we know, is slightly different from the way that it was when colonization actually started. When colonization started, the center of the world was more like this. And what is exactly at the center of that center of the world? What would you say is closest to the actual there? Africa, okay. Specifically, Europe. Africa, Europe, right? What do you see in the exact middle of Africa and Europe? The Mediterranean. Yeah. Yes, this body of water right here is literally to most people that we're going to be talking about. So we're going to take a minute and just learn a little bit about the history of this particular body of water. And the reason that we're doing that, and it matters to American colonialism. So bear with me, because this is going to take a little while. Everybody that had a culture that formed and lasted fought over access to the Mediterranean. Ancient Mesopotamian cultures fought over controlling the coastlines of it. You couldn't, Egypt, the upper Nile or the lower Nile of Egypt poured out into the Mediterranean, and this is where the palaces were. The Greek and ancient Roman, they all tried to establish themselves as superpowers by claiming land on the Mediterranean. The reason for that was because the Mediterranean was such a powerful breeder of trading cultures. I mean, it was the Phoenicians, who were in this area over here, who developed ships that allowed them to trade with every single other part of the Mediterranean coastline. And because they had to do that, they developed a language that used symbols for sounds so that they could write down multiple languages without switching alphabets from one language to another. I mean, the Mediterranean is like the cooking area of most modern cultures. And control over the Mediterranean is the source of great, warfare. So here we have like the Phoenician Empire and the ancient Greek Empire settling all these coastal areas, sending out and creating colonies on the coasts and islands all around this one body of water. So control of the Mediterranean is really hideously important to ancient civilizations. And it's because of that that they start developing these massive technologies like faster boats, better weapons, the ability to roll in and take over areas as possible. Alexander the Great rolling in with his chariots and his ancient Greek coming in with their what were they called? Oh, it doesn't matter. Great big masses of men with shields. Phalanx. Yes, I don't know who said it. Good job. With their phalanxes, all of that was so that they could maintain control of this coastal area. In the 2 to 3000 BC, a lot of that was the Greco-Roman Empire. Rome, which was a city-state that had been a colony of Greece, spread out, took over, launched its military, and took over a vast landmass around the Mediterranean. While they were there, while they were in control of this, the Mediterranean was a highway. It was a place, a way to get in between colonies, just as surely as, the town square would be a way to get in between shops. It was a highway. It was a way of connecting people. We connected them through ships that went back and forth from your island colony to their island colony. And you went back into the land too. You went backwards using the strength that you gained from having control of this area. You were able to build armies backwards into the land and spread backwards. But control over the Mediterranean was the most important thing. Rome took over this massive area, and all of these places were directly ruled by Rome. These places were all ruled by people that had Rome's permission to exist and paid tribute to them. And then up here, they also had areas that they had treaties with, the Visigoths and people like that, barbarians living through the German forest, that they had treaties with. But all of them paid tribute so that they could maintain control of the Mediterranean. It was just that important. Eventually, this kingdom became too big to control, and it fell apart and was taken over by invaders from various places, who then set up kingdoms. But because trade in the Mediterranean was so important, they still kept a common language, they kept a common coinage, they kept trading with the same kind of money, they used the same technology, they used the same written alphabet. They kept doing that because trading across this massive highway was so important. Something changed in about 600 AD. Anybody want to guess what it was? No clue? Okay, I'm just checking. In about 200 BC, this Mediterranean body of water connected to Asia and became the end point of what we call the Silk Road. So all of the goods that traded across this area poured into the Mediterranean and up into the land on those coastal areas around the Mediterranean. Now, the Silk Road has two components to it. It's land and water. The red you can see is the land. The blue you can see is the water. So trade with all of these little cultures all pooled into the Mediterranean. Here are some of the things that you traded. Let me get rid of this. Shrink this a little bit here. There we go. Okay, so horses from the middle part of Asia were traded east with the Chinese and then west with the Mediterranean cultures. Porcelain came all the way from China. Paper, gunpowder, incredibly important. And perfumes and textiles and all of these things are things that were moved across the Silk Road and ended up in these cultures around the Mediterranean, which became like these little, urban centers that were full of everything. You know how you can go, if you're in New York City, you can go this way and find Chinatown, you go that way and find Germantown, you go this way and this same sort of thing would happen in, for instance, Rome or in Athens. You'd be able to find all of the cultures for the whole Silk Road poured into one area. So trade around the Mediterranean is incredibly important. A lot of those are luxury things. And one of the things that that goes west to east is, for example, wine. The vineyards of the Greeks poured wine into Asia and into China, and the Chinese poured tea into the Mediterranean, not into the Mediterranean, but into the cultures of the Mediterranean. So a lot of luxury goods went back and forth. In about 600 AD, a new culture arose, based on a prophet Muhammad, who had what he claimed to be a revelation from Gabriel came down and told him that the entire interpretation of the will of God had been misinterpreted by the Christians. It was his job to re-educate everybody. That's basically the life of Muhammad. If you want to know more about that, you have to take Rome Cid 1. But his following grew to the point where whole governments were based around his the leaders that followed him, so his disciples. And they were holistic governments, which means that they had, unlike, for example, the early Christians before they before Rome took Christianity and made it, across the entire Roman Empire. The people in power were the clerics of Islam. So the people who made decisions for the whole community were the Islamic leaders, were the religious leaders too. One of the defining characteristics of these cultures is that they had a lot that was forbidden to them, and things that were only permitted. So they only used their own language. They only used their own language. They only used products that fit in with their religious practices. So not luxury products, not a lot of gold, not a lot of soap, no wine. So all of these products that had been traded across the Mediterranean, as the Islamic people grew, as those governments grew and those countries became bigger and bigger, they began to take over more and more territory. Suddenly, these people couldn't trade with them anymore. And the Mediterranean stopped being a highway and starts being a border. You can't cross the Mediterranean to trade with the people of the other side, of the eastern side of the Mediterranean, because they don't want your goods in. They don't want what you have to sell. So, here is an example of, as they begin to take over more territory, what Islamic areas controlled as far as the Silk Road. Can you make out that line? Can you see that green line? So you see the great big line that's being drawn around this area? So if you were a trader, a merchant, all of these areas are controlled by Islamic countries, by Islamic forces, by Islamic. And there wasn't, I don't want you to get the wrong idea, the kind of radical, extremist Islamic behavior that takes its roots from the 1900s, maybe arguably the late 1800s. So we're not talking about a strong militant that would kill anybody that comes in my area. They just weren't interested in what the North and Western Mediterranean cultures had to sell. They just weren't interested. And as a result, and because they were spreading, the trade got more and more difficult. So the Mediterranean cultures that had been trading that way began to go up into the land instead, north, and begin to take over more area of that. And as they did, they established a Christian oversight. The church had oversight over all these areas. So if you were living in one of these places, you were probably ruled by a knight, who was ruled by a duke, who gave his fealty to a king, but realistically, you were ruled by a knight. If you were a part of this community, the only thing really that tied everybody together was the church, because the church had been established by the whole Roman Empire. So Rome had established it before it fell apart. So it still had authority, regardless of who was king, because Rome was still in charge. So the authority for your spiritual life was supposed to be coming from the Pope, which would then come down to a bishop, which should then be handed to a priest. But realistically, it comes from the priest. Do you see what I mean? It's like a big triangle. And on, okay, so the order puts at the top here a king, and over here the Pope. And power flows downward to lesser and lesser and lesser. So if most of the population is peasants, then this is where they sit. And this is where all of their authority comes from. Okay? You with me so far? This is what we call feudal society. In reality, as your daily life goes by, you're probably never going to meet these people. You're never going to actually meet the people that are in charge of your daily life. The people that are in charge of you are these people. So it creates this system of Well, if I've got a priest in my village who doesn't really know that much about the Bible, that's still going to be what I learn about. If I've got a knight who is vicious and brutal and not very good at local justice, that's just my life. Does that make sense? Okay. And the reason for that is because they had to expand to north because the area of the Mediterranean became unfriendly to trade. So realistically, this is I guess this is a map. If you were from France, you wouldn't have called yourself a person from the Kingdom of France. You would have called yourself a person from the Dukedom of Normandy or the Dukedom of the Aquitaine. You would have referred to yourself as a Norman, not a Frenchman, because your authority came from you from a much more local place. The reason that I'm bringing this up is because this creates a situation in which power struggles happen all the time. If your authority as a peasant comes from this guy and this guy has a fight to pick with somebody else, even though you both serve the same duke, you're going to find yourself in a war between you and another knight because you're a peasant. So we're talking about an entire continent, Europe, of people that are at each other's throats, pretty much constantly from battle to. You with me so far? Okay. In 1066, the Duke of Normandy has a power play. This is Normandy right here. The Duke of Normandy has a power play went across the water and started conquering England and created his own kingdom. So at the same time that he was the King of England, he was the Duke of Normandy and owed his skills to the King of France. But it didn't matter because he could be King of France. If they ever disagreed, he could totally whoop him because he had the entire Kingdom of England behind him. So this creates a brand new kingdom that has a sort of a vicious relationship with most of the European kingdoms. Sometimes they form treaties and sometimes they agree, but for the most part, the English are always going to be the people that disagree with authority, that buck the authority of the continent. And that takes place here, but it also takes place here. The English are never really sure whether or not they want the Pope to be in charge. That really manifests itself later when they start fighting about religious things. The Pope sees this, sees all of these knights fighting with each other, and sees them, bickering for power with each other, and decides that they need something better to occupy their time. So he creates the idea that Christian knights have a responsibility to take Jerusalem back from the Muslim forces that are holding it now. Or, possibly, the other side of that story, the Pope receives a vision from heaven, informing him that Jerusalem is in the hands of those that God does not want it to be in the hands of, and as a result summons the forces of Christianity to swoop in on a holy mission to go and free it. It really just depends on which version you read, what actually happened. The end result is that all of the kings of all of these little kingdoms that are always fighting with each other, who all technically respect the authority of the Pope, go on crusade together against a common enemy, which is the Muslim forces that hold Jerusalem. And that's the beginning of the Crusades. There are lots of them, and never in any of them do the Christian forces actually take Jerusalem. They hold it for like a minute, and then they lose over and over again. And ultimately, as they do, this becomes a harder border because it becomes harder to trade with a civilization that you're constantly attacking. So, the Crusades actually create a stronger border in the Mediterranean. They also bring a lot of other things back with them. European forces that go down into the Mediterranean and down into the east and fight come back with the technology that they found. For example, all of the technology from all the way over to the east, from China, new innovations that are coming out of China all land in these Islamic countries and then get, improved. And then the Crusaders come down and invade and are like, oh, this is cool. For example, folded steel, steel that's tempered better than anything that they have in Europe. Ship technology. This is a caravel, which is a very fast-moving ship that can not just take long voyages, but can also navigate around coastlines really well. So weapons and technology get exchanged in a really big way. They also come back with a lot of art and science. And the reason for that is because this whole time that the eastern part of the Mediterranean has been conquered by Islam, the western part of the Mediterranean has had to walk away from places like ancient Greece. They've held on to it. They've kept libraries. They've kept materials. They've kept everything archived. So when the European knights come down, they're like, oh, Aristotle, Plato. I vaguely remember somebody mentioning these, and then they come back with all these original writings that they had lost when the Mediterranean became a border instead of a highway. So they bring those things back to France and back to England, and they start to share them. Like, look at these philosophies and sciences, and crazy things like astronomy and geography and medicine. Oh my gosh, the medicine. The Islamic countries have really grown the practice of good medicine, and those things filtered into Europe and became what we call the scientific revolution and the Renaissance. Suddenly you have people with all new ideas and a little bit of distrust for the church, because one of the other things that it brings back with it is disease. The interaction of the Crusades brings back the Black Plague, not brings back, but brings the Black Plague to Europe. And what happens in a lot of cases is that knights will come back from crusade to a city center, to a place that's an urban center, and they'll be sick, their men will be sick. And then the people in the city center will go, it's the plague, they're sick. I'm going to flee to the countryside where I will be safe. And now suddenly the disease is also fleeing to the countryside because nobody knows what's actually causing it. Any of y'all know what was actually causing it?
Fleas on rats.
Fleas on rats. Yeah. So like they killed a lot of things they didn't need to kill because the thing that was actually causing it was so small they couldn't really, keep track. They had fleas in their clothing, but they were killing all the rats, And not just rats, but hamsters. Did you know that there was like a massive trade in hamsters at this time? I didn't know that until last year. I was like, what? But there was, for some reason, they were trading hamsters. There was a big trade in Chinese hamsters. Anyway.
They killed the cats.
They thought the cats were doing it, and they thought certain people were doing it too. There was, at this time, there's a large-scale killing of whole Jewish communities because they're pretty sure somehow it's the Jews' fault. Because isn't it always, according to some people? Anyway, so there's all kinds of blame, there's all kinds of distrust. One of the things that happens is the one point of authority everybody agrees on is the church, right? Okay, except that the church has responsibilities when you're dying. They're supposed to come and anoint the sick. They're supposed to come and bury the dead. Before you die, a priest is supposed to come to you and give you last rites and hear your confession so you can go to heaven. And they can't because people are just dying too fast. So is it that you can't go to heaven unless a priest comes and blesses you, which is what they let the peasants believe? You need your priest. Otherwise, you're not going to go to heaven, you're going to go to purgatory. Or is it that the priests have dropped the ball and should be held responsible for all the people they're letting go to purgatory who shouldn't, because they should have been blessed? Either way, you look at it, you've been told your whole life, if you die and a priest doesn't visit you before your death, you're going straight to purgatory. You form a good relationship with your priest, so he'll be there when you die, right? But if he's not showing up, or if he's overworked, and or more importantly, the person you love dies without having gotten that visit from the priest. I mean, in my other profession, I'm a pastor, and I'm telling you, as a Methodist pastor, if I don't visit somebody in the hospital and they die, everybody gets upset. Okay, because I didn't make it to the hospital and they died without having seen me. And that's not even Catholic, that's Methodist. So we're talking about peasants who genuinely believe that the priests had a responsibility. And they just couldn't do it because people were dying too fast, and bishops were hiding in their castles. So suddenly there's a lot of distrust for the church. At the same time that all these new ideas are coming back from ancient philosophers, and at the same time the scientific revolutions are happening. So that's probably the biggest legacy of the Crusade is all of a sudden there's a whole class of people, the peasants, who don't trust the church, who are tired of their authority, and who are a lot less, so their work is more valued. All of that kind of adds to this moment as the Islamic territories get taken over by an emperor and united under a single emperor, the Ottoman Empire. They also close everything down. Now, if you want to trade through their area, you can't be from that crusader class. You have to make all kinds of arrangements, you have to pay all kinds of money, because now they're militantly against the idea of open trade. Because of those crusades, basically. So the Mediterranean is more a highway than it ever has been before. But the goods that people in Europe want are on the other side of that highway. They're in China. They're in India. Everybody in the world wants tea. Everybody in Europe wants tea and can't get to it without going through all of these, jumping through all of these hoops to get through these Islamic government, and that's if they let you through, and that's only if you come through the relationship, and it's hard. So, these are the trading routes that are controlled by the Islamic world. And if you are part of the European Christian world, these are trading routes that you don't necessarily have access. So if you need to get here, how do you do it? What are your options? Well, nobody knows what's over there. So first, you try going around the coast of Africa, and immediately you run into, you can't do a straight, you have to stop and land and resupply and all of that kind of stuff. And if you're not careful, you still run into coastal trading centers that belong to Islam. So, in the midst of all of this, you have somebody who basically is the culmination of all these things. He is a product of the scientific revolution. He is himself a scientist. He has studied the documents of ancient, of Aristotle and Ptolemy, and he has studied the astronomers. He is a philosopher who believes that human beings have power, that, are intrinsically able to do things and are not necessarily 100% at the mercy of the gods, of God specifically. And he is somebody who believes that it is incredibly important that Europe continue to trade with Asia and India. So he does the math. He establishes that this is how big the world is, and I think we covered this the other day. This is how big the world is, so it makes perfect sense. And if you looked at his maps, you would agree with me. These are maps that are based on high science. We're not talking about somebody who thought the world was flat and it turned out not to be true. We're talking about somebody who thought the world was small and it turned out to be big. The map lined up. It should have taken 6 to 8 months, maybe a year, to get from Europe to Asia, according to the maps that he was using, according to the globe that was the height of scientific technology at the time. I've looked at it, and I'm not enough of a scientist, but when I look at it and I draw the triangles, I'm like, yeah, I can understand how to get to that conclusion. He sailed west to try to find a route to Asia and ran into this new continent, this new series of islands. Immediately thereafter, 6 years later, an English man is tasked with sailing west to also explore, and everybody is basically looking for a way to get through these islands to Asia. Except that they're not islands. They're massive continents with a great big mountain chain in the middle of them. There still is not a way to sail directly from Europe to Asia through America, through the Americas. There's no way to do it. You can go through the Panama Canal, but I wouldn't if I were you. It's much easier to go the other way. But anyway, and as a result, between 1492 and 1520, every civilization in Europe is trying to find a way to the New World. There are other things at work that are also happening. Yes. You want me to go back? Oh, okay. I didn't click it. So there are other things at work. There are other factors at play here. Who it is that actually lands and finds that way through to Asia will probably control it. So it's important to maintain control. So you want to be the king who sends the person who finds the way, because that way you'll be the one in charge of the trade. And just like they have to negotiate with Suleiman and the Ottoman Empire, they'll have to negotiate with you because you're from Portugal who's found a way through. You want that, you want it to be your territory. But there are other things at play too. For example, on the Iberian Peninsula, which is the peninsula that Spain sits on, the Iberian Peninsula, has always been a tug of war between Islamic and Christian forces. Because it's also right on the edge of North Africa, so it makes sense for the Islamic forces to come around North Africa up into the Iberian Peninsula and control it. It's also southern Europe, so they have been fighting for about 500 years over it. In 1519, the last battle takes place, and you can see a little progression here. This is what they get as they take over more and more of the peninsula. Christian forces, the king in Spain, they, over the course of 500 years, they gain more and more and more and more territory. And finally, they have their last battle in Granada, and they exit all of the Islamic forces out of Granada, and now they own the whole peninsula, which is good, because as king and queen of Spain, their claim to the throne is really, really, really skinny. You have to go back into their family tree to understand why, but basically, They only have the throne because of a technical loophole in the Greenwood Treaty. So it's good that they obviously also have the grace of God to help them take over their peninsula. God must be on their side, therefore they must be supposed to be king and queen. But just to be on the safe side, we want to make sure that we are fulfilling the will of God and showing everybody in the world that we are, because our son, the king and queen of Spain's son, is going to take over this massive piece of property, and you don't want anybody to question his right to rule it. And the only way that people won't question his right to rule it is if the relationship between him and the Pope is 100% solid. He obviously has the blessing of the Pope. And the only way to do that is to do a mission for God. So, under the pretext of doing mission work among these islanders in this new world, they launch an expedition under Spanish and Portuguese forces to go to the New World. They don't immediately just find a great place to do mission work. They don't just find indigenous people who have never heard of Christ and therefore, are, well, convert or die population. They also find a lot of really valuable things when they get there. So if you're a resident of Spain and you are like the second son or the third son or something like that, and you have an opportunity to go across to the New World and land yourself a fortune, you're probably going to do it, because not only will you have fortune, but you will also have land. Wow. That is, I guess the weather wizard fell asleep. Oh well. Cool. Anyway, so, I'm being respectful. In the midst of all of this, one of the people that goes over there is by the name of Hernan Cortez. Hernan Cortez is an ambitious man. He goes and he's supposed to be working for the governor of New Spain, which is headquartered on one of those islands. And then under a really sketchy interpretation of his own orders, he goes to the mainland and starts an expedition to the mainland of Central America. And he finds Tenochtitlan. What you have here is a picture of the battle of Tenochtitlan. When he first went there, they had already been decimated by disease, but they welcomed him. And he left to go face trial for having disobeyed his orders. And in his absence, all of his men were chased out of the city and was called the Noche Triste, which was the Night of Tears. And he marches back with an army that's not very many Spanish soldiers, but it's quite a few disgruntled Tlaxcalans and people that don't really like the Aztecs that much because they're tired of being produced to them. He comes back at the head of an army, he raids the causeways, he brings his ships in and controls them from the outside, and he manages to take the whole city, and therefore cut the head off of this tributary empire and make it all part of Spain. So, glory for Spain. In England, the church relationship situation that's happening in England is that they have a king who also has a really sketchy claim to the throne, Henry VIII. He is the grandchild of somebody who basically stole it, and he has a really sketchy hold on the throne. He's been blessed by the Pope because he married one of the Pope's relatives, Catherine, and as a result, the Pope has a vested interest in seeing him, succeed. But Catherine can't seem to have a son, which is somehow Catherine's fault because science, or lack thereof, as it turns out. And he falls in love with his mistress, and the Pope won't grant him an annulment, so he has to leave the church. And so he says, God has visited me and has yes.
Is that where he tries to not his own religion, but tries to make the king as important as the Pope or more important?
Right. And when he leaves the church, he basically creates a church that's identical to the Catholic Church in every way, except that the King of England is now the head of the church. So that's the beginning of the Anglican Church. Sketchy. So sketchy. His hold on power is so sketchy. And then he marries his mistress, and then he has her beheaded, like you do. And then he marries the next person, and she has a son, so yay, but then she dies, like right after her son is born. So he just has the one son. So he gets remarried, and he divorces that one. And then he gets remarried and beheads that one, and then he gets remarried and that one outlives him. So, he gets married over and over again, which is something he couldn't have done before because, you can't divorce in the The Catholic Church would, you can only get annulled, you can't get divorced. So as a result, his son's claim to the throne is pretty strong because it's the son was born to the wife after the one that he had beheaded, so it's good, solid relations, not born out of wedlock or anything. He's not a bastard son. But the son is sick from the minute he's born, and he dies when he's like 17 years old. And now you have to leave this power to somebody else. And in the midst of all of that, other religious ideas start to filter into England. And so it has its own sort of flavor, the Church of England. When the Spanish start to gain all this ground in Central America, it makes the English very nervous because the English don't want the Spanish in charge of the trading because their King Henry was pissed off the Spanish quite a bit by divorcing his first wife. So he leaves his throne to one of his daughters, who then dies, and then the other daughter. Well, he leaves it to his son. His son leaves it to his older sister. His older sister leaves it to the younger sister. Sketchy claim to the throne. Because these are the children of the wives that were killed. This is the children of the wife that was divorced and the child of the wife that was beheaded, who are now in charge of England and have to assert themselves as, no, but we're supposed to be here. God wants me to be here. You understand that? Oh, if it's a power play that you're after, you have to prove in this medieval world that God wanted you to be queen. So Queen Elizabeth, in defiance of the Spanish, sends her own explorer to the New World, and he lands quite a bit further north. She sends Sir Walter Raleigh, and that's who this is. This is Sir Walter Raleigh. He's fabulous. She sends him over there. While he establishes a colony that kind of falls apart, she sends John White to establish another colony. They discover Chesapeake Bay. So we're going to talk about Chesapeake Bay when we start to talk about how that factors into colonies. But it matters that it's Chesapeake Bay. He finds his way into it, not Central America. It is completely different from Central America in that there are no large cities. There's no Tenochtitlan in Chesapeake Bay. So they are able to establish, but there are indigenous people that are living there. He's able to establish a colony called Ronan. You're giggling. Okay, how many of y'all are supernatural fans? I'm just curious. All right, so you've heard of Ronan, right? All right, I just want to say for the record that they got that completely wrong. But
they figured out where they went.
Well, not just that, but even in the episode they say, and he disappeared overnight.
Oh,
And I'm like, no, they didn't. What actually happened is John White went to establish a colony on this island in the bay. And then he left to go resupply. He took ships back to England to resupply. And when he got back, here is what he found. The Spanish Armada was attacking England. And so he found himself trapped in England, unable to return to his colony for 3 years. Not overnight, 3 years. When he got back, the colony was gone. There was some evidence that there had been some conflict, but mostly what there was evidence is that it was abandoned and that the survivors went and lived among the natives that were there. And that's why you have stories of blue-eyed native children, in the surrounding area. And the only evidence that they left behind was a word scrawled in one of the trees, which is Croatoan, which is close to the name of the tribe that was living nearby. So was somebody etching into the tree as they were being attacked? I ask you, do you have time to do this while you're actively being attacked? Or was it, we'll leave a note so they know where we went? So probably that's what happened. Either way, England was not having very much luck establishing a colony. As a matter of fact, their luck was pretty much non-existent as far as that went. So why establish colonies? So most of the reasons that these European countries established colonies fit under 3 basic categories, and I'll bet you learned them in elementary school. Yes?
Tomatoes.
Tomato. Okay, specifically?
Crops. Like the crops that were only in America, like cocoa.
Right, so cash crops. Yeah, the things that you can only find in America. And that's definitely here. They fit under the categories of God, gold, and glory. So these are the reasons why people establish colonies. Cash crops are a really big part of that. Here I've got several pictures of people wearing pearls in ancient paintings, not ancient, medieval paintings, Renaissance era paintings, not even medieval. But pearls became one of the height of fashion, and like you can see Elizabeth's outfits all decked out in pearls. And the reason for that is because when Cortez and the other Spanish forces got to the islands down there in Central America, they found pearls. And then they sent slaves to die for the pearls. And a lot of slaves died rounding up pearls so that people in Europe have pearls. And that's a cash crop. But yes, tomatoes, tobacco, corn, which is an incredibly durable food source that Europe did not have. Beans and squash, which they mostly traded to Africa, which then became cash staple crops in Africa.
Some livestock too.
They brought livestock with them, but then they had all this ample land in which to breed that livestock. So that became a cash crop of the colonies down there. So that's a good reason to establish colonies, is because there's crops. The biggest reason they always said was because of God. The reason why you establish a colony is because you're going to bring God to the uncivilized, primitive world that doesn't know God. And that is the biggest reason why we're doing this. And if God chooses to make us rich in the process, then that was a choice God made as we were doing his missionary work. Most of the propaganda was go to the new world and serve God. That's what you're doing it for. But really, probably the biggest motivation was glory. The chance to be an adventurer and be an explorer in a world that was feudal, that was settled, that was plague-ridden and depressing and dispirited and polluted, and the chance to go out and have an adventure in the era after adventures, basically. Because that wave of let's go have an adventure, that comes and goes all through world history, doesn't it? And they had one during the Crusades, but that was like 300 years ago. And so this new wave of what's the new adventure that we can have? 300 years later, there'll be another one. That's why we're in space now. Wave of adventure. The opportunity to establish yourself as one of those mythic explorers, because if you were an explorer going to the new world, when you came back, you were welcome in court to tell your story. So, and if you were one of those second or third sons that was never going to inherit whatever land your father had, you had the opportunity to become a wealthy landowner in America. So most of the reason that people established colonies was because of the glory. But it didn't go well most of the time. It takes a special collection of formulas in order to make a colony work. And those formulas are, well, it took some time to figure out what they were. So what I'm going to have you do between now and Wednesday is that I'm going to read a primary source. It's a primary source document called The Starving Times, which is written about Jamestown. And we'll talk about the history of Jamestown on Wednesday, but I want you to kind of get a feel for how the colonists felt about Jamestown. Now, here's a note about primary source documents. Whenever you read a primary source document, it's critically important that you ask yourself 3 questions. Who wrote this? Who did they write it for? And why did they write it? In no particular order. Because whatever the answers to those questions are will also be where the bias in that document is. So The Starving Times is largely written by John Smith, but it doesn't say that. Everybody knows that he wrote it, but he's also the main character. He doesn't say I, he says he. The bold and noble John Smith, written by John Smith. But, so mostly it was written as his own propaganda by himself. It was written for audiences in Europe, not for colonists. It was written for the people that were not there. Specifically, it was written for the upper classes of people that weren't there. And it was written for, now I'm going to let you answer why it was written. So I'm not going to tell you to answer that. I want you to read it first and tell me why you think it. But bring that, impression with you to class. The first colony that gets established by the English that actually survives any length of time at all is a place where disaster after disaster after disaster hits. And then something happens to make it a stable colony. But we're going to cover that on Wednesday, the history of Jamestown. Does anybody have any questions? There's no written assignment associated with this yet, but will be one. But go ahead and give it a look. I will probably know if you read it or not, because if you don't come back going, ew, gross, then I know you probably haven't at the document. Okay, so any questions on anything we covered yet? Oh, the doctor, where is this? Let me answer that question real quick. Okay, so if you look under this week, the Starving Time is right here. If you can't remember which company you're in, primary sources are also under start here. Put them in a separate folder. Where you can- Yeah, they are. They're under file materials and directory. So, some questions to think about now. Your exam has 2 essay questions on it, always has 2 essay questions on it, and they're always from the primary source class. So even if you think you can skate by without reading it for the sake of class, at some point you probably didn't have to do it. So I recommend doing a lot of the time. Any questions you were going to ask about?
In the